So welcome everyone. I can see there are some people here, this is their first time here. So today we are doing a presentation, as you can see, on reasonable adjustments. And this came about from quite lengthy discussions, I would say, Ren and other members of what we call the Axia Collective. So there's a group of us that's sort of a cross-section of Axia that meet on a fortnightly basis. And we do what's called co-produce. So we have a number of neurodivergent people in that group, and anything we need to consult on or think about promoting, we take to that group. And that started off around a discussion around reasonable adjustments, and it's gone on, and Ren has developed it into a presentation that we hope you're going to enjoy, and maybe there'll be a bit of interaction later. According to how long that takes, and according to if Hilary turns up. So Hilary did ask for a slot to talk about the garden that she's doing at the Royal Horticultural Society in Tatton Park. So if she turns up, that will be interesting. Some of you may have been watching Chelsea and will have seen that the National Autistic Society garden won a silver gilt medal. And it was quite interesting listening to Monty and Joe, I think that's their names, saying at first they didn't fully understand the garden because it was about masking. And when they moved from the bit that was about masking that they didn't particularly like or understand, when they got round the back of the garden, which was where autistic people were free to be who they were, then they got it and said that was absolutely beautiful. So I think that was really interesting. Then, if we've got time, we'll let you know about Chester Pride, that we're going to be having a stand there at Chester Pride and welcome people coming. And then, in relation to that, we're going to talk to you about the CAS review, which was a review looking at services for transgender people. And I'll try and explain the relevance and why we're linking those together. Because everyone always asks us what the date and the time of the next PDSG is, this time I've actually thought ahead and got the answer. So the next PDSG, which I'll remind you again at the end, is the 10th of July, and it's Luke Bearden, and it's going to be a question and answer session, and Dream will explain how we can use your questions. So without me going on and on, Ren, over to you. By the way, this is not to amplify my voice, which, as you know, is loud enough as it is. This is for the recording. If when you ask questions, you don't want to be recorded, that's fine. We edit things out and we can summarise your questions. Ren.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. I'm Ren. Some of you will know me, some of you may not. I am a diagnostician at Axia and a member of the Anime Amigos, the lovely trio in the back, making us a quadro. Don't know if that's a word. It's not a word. Thank you. So we mostly talk about, clues in the name, anime, but more widely, nerdy special interests, which seem to make a massive part of neurodivergent culture, really. If you attend a Comic-Con, chances are you'll meet another person who is neurodivergent. I haven't got estimates, but I'd probably say, I don't want to say 40%, but it's very high, much higher than you see in the general population. So I'm a long-time fan of video games, board games, card games, which I will talk about within this presentation, but I've always wanted to talk about them in relation to reasonable adjustments, and through talking with the Axia Collective, the other excellent members, we've co-produced this presentation, and without further ado, we'll get on with it. So just as a little overview of the structure, I'll first be talking about 3 examples of some nerdy interests that I and other people share. What sort of skills are involved with those games and with those interests, and some sort of commonalities between those as well. What the environments in which we play those games look like, and how they might differ from one another. And how to go about making changes within those spaces. Part 2, not really part 2, but the second sort of bulk of what I'm going to talk about will be a bit more formalised. So that will be looking at the Equality Act, which is the sort of guiding structure, the legal structure for which through which we implement reasonable adjustments and think about how our environment can be made different, thinking about disability as a protected characteristic. Then a little bit on defining what's reasonable, because unfortunately that is quite a complex term because it's subjective. So considering, hopefully, two perspectives within that. There's some case studies, some examples I've found, and a consideration of what can be done if changes aren't made and what occurs then. So next slide, please. So, first of all, I'd be very surprised if you haven't heard of Dungeons and Dragons. So, this is a not card game, it's a tabletop role-playing game that came about in, I think it was the 70s, it sort of was popularised. Ostensibly, it's a game that involves you and a group of other people engaging in a narrative together. So, you might take the part of a player and you are enacting a role as a character within this fictional narrative. One player, part of the group, is the Dungeon Master. And what they do is they create events and they narrate things that occur that the players then have to deal with. So, for example, a player might take the role of a fighter or a warrior or a wizard within a party, and then that party then goes on an adventure. The adventure involves goblins, and so the Dungeon Master describes, how the goblins might, what the goblins' camp looks like, what actions they're taking, and how, and then gives the focus to the players to decide what their characters do. It's guided by dice, as you can see. That's a 20-sided dice, which is the most commonly used one within Dungeons and Dragons, but also uses 4-sided dice, 6, all the way up to 20, and even 100-sided dice, which usually use 2 10-sided dice anyway. Your characters have statistics, so how strong they are, how charismatic, how intelligent, how wise, those kind of things. And all of these traits determine the probability of your character's success in a given action. So for example, every time a warrior swings a sword, you will roll a 20-sided dice, and if the result is good, then you'll hit them. If the result is bad, then you might miss and drop your sword or something like that. So D&D is, I think, interesting in a lot of ways because it contains within it a fantasy world, which is totally at the will of the players and the Dungeon Master. And if people don't like things that occur, you can have that conversation as a group and work around them, and it's very problem-solving. Often there'll be riddles that the Dungeon Master might have prepared for the party to answer and to resolve. Other people love the artistic aspect and illustrate their characters or the environments. There's loads of YouTube series and things out there. Most popular among them is Critical Role, where people you can watch voice actors then voice the characters and act out the roles, which is amazing viewing content. I highly recommend. But getting down to it, so what it actually involves, I would say, from a fine motor skills perspective, you will be writing down pieces of information using pen and paper. You might be taking notes of things that have happened in the adventure, things that you might need to remember for later on. There's an element of, for some people, assembling miniatures, painting miniatures as well. People like to have little models that depict their characters and their actions. So it's not a necessary part of the game, but it can enhance it. And pretty much since D&D's inception, people have been using miniatures. And also rolling dice, of course. So, that if you don't want the dice to roll off the table or hit someone on the head, as has happened, that involves an element of fine motor coordination. Furthermore, you'll be communicating with other players. You'll be listening to other people's descriptions, reading information perhaps, comprehending the rules, problem solving as a group. But also inserting yourself into the role of a character. So that requires, the role-playing element, which is what D&D is based around. Next slide, please. I'd be even more surprised if none of you have heard of this one. So this is Pokemon. That yellow mascot is Pikachu. Pokemon started off as a video game franchise in the 90s and later sprung into anime, which is Japanese animation. movies, live action films as well, music, all sorts. There's so much to enjoy about it, and it's one of the most popular franchises in the world. So it started out on the Game Boy, which is a little console probably about this big. You'd need a small little grip like about this in order to play on it. Like obviously not the most ideal, but it was handheld and you could take it with you wherever. But it kind of took off after that point, immediately was successful, and lots of different generations of the video game followed. The premise is that you collect creatures like Pikachu there, you train them and battle them against each other. So each of these Pokemon has different things that they're good at. For example, Pikachu is an electric type, so he uses electric moves. There are Pokemon that are water type, which use water type moves, and as you might imagine, water is not very effective against electric. Electric deals more damage to water Pokemon. So, like when you're actually playing the video game, it's purely a case of your motions being fine motor coordination. Nowadays, we play on the Nintendo Switch, which is about this length. You can play handheld or on a TV screen using a controller. And you need to be able to maneuver that about, plug it in, and sometimes just move the console about. There's a lot of reading involved. You need to read the description of the Pokemon, the moves that they use, the events that take place within the game. And there's also an element of probability. So some Pokemon might have an attack that will not hit 100% of the time. It might hit like 95% of the time, so that's 1 in 20. You need to think about, okay, well, if I'm going to use this move, what's the chances that it does something? Will it do nothing? And if it does nothing, do I really want to use it? So there's also the problem-solving element there. There's memorizing involved as well. I spoke about how electric is strong against water. You need to remember basically what types are good against other types and what's weak against other types. And while you can play Pokemon single player, like not without anyone else, you can also play cooperatively or against other people. If you're playing against other people, inherently that will involve an element of social communication, so you'll be talking to them. You might sit down and across from someone and ask them if they want to play a game, which is conversing with them. In tournament settings as well, you need to be able to communicate to judges and to other players what your intentions are, or to attempt to resolve a misunderstanding. So that also forms a part of the experience of playing Pokemon. Next slide, please. This is my favourite one. I put that image in because it's how I used to have all my cards when I was like 12 years old and I didn't know how to take good care of them. So as you can see, they're all battered and worn. I used to keep them in elastic bands, which would just ruin them. And I think about my Pokemon collection of cards when I was a kid. Regrettably, I looked on eBay. One of them is now worth about 500 quid. It was in that sort of state, so it'd probably be worth about 50p. And I don't have it anymore, sadly. I think I sent it in an envelope without a sleeve on eBay, like years and years ago. So anyway, the mistakes you make. So Magic the Gathering is a trading card game. So the first most important part is the card game. These are the little playing pieces, similar to like a deck of cards, that you use to play the game. So you collect them by buying booster packs, which contain like 15 or so of them, and you can build a deck from the cards that you own. You will also, the sort of like, the fantasy of the game is that you are a wizard and you are fighting against another player who has their own deck, and they are also a wizard, and they summon creatures and cast spells and do all sorts of sorcerous things in an attempt to win the game. There's a lot of maths involved in Magic as well. So you and your opponent both start with 20 life points. The most common way of winning is by reducing your opponent's life points to 0. You might attack with a monster that has 3 attack, and then they will go from 20 to 17 life points, if that makes sense. So you subtract whatever the power of the creature is. There's also a strong element of probability. Each deck consists of 60 cards. If you've drawn, 20-odd cards of your deck, the chance that you see a particular card that you might want or need increases if you haven't already seen that card, because you've reduced the number of possibilities there are left. So Not to kind of go on about it, but quite complex, but very fun. You can play it at like a very competitive level, like a high-level tournament, or you can play on your kitchen table with your friends and family, having just bought your first deck. Both are very fun, but the learning curve can be quite difficult. So, yep, in terms of physically playing the game, you will need to be able to hold the cards in your hand, like 4 or 5 of them or 7 of them at a time in your hand. You will need to be able to shuffle a deck of cards, which might prove difficult. If you don't want them to end up in this state, you can have little card protectors, which are called sleeves. They're effectively plastic wallets that you put the cards in to protect them from wear and tear. So if you'd need to basically be able to sort of like do the fiddly process to sort that out. And the social skills as well. Most commonly, Magic is played face-to-face with you sitting across from your opponent or multiple opponents. Again, you need to be able to communicate them what you're doing with your cards, what the effects of your cards are. Interestingly, I played in a tournament recently where there was a lot of non-English speakers, and it actually ended up not being so much of a barrier, the language barrier. It wasn't so much of an issue because we both were working off of the same sort of assumptions. We both know the rules of the game, so there wasn't so much of a need for me to explain in English what I was intending to do. I could just point at a card, which they then understood, and then I could point at their card and they go, so I see what you're doing with that. It bypassed the need for me to verbally communicate what I was going to do, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Magic can be, it is actually a great source of enjoyment for a lot of autistic people, because where social communication, verbal language can be very challenging, it's a shortcut to that. You don't have to think, because you and your opponent are working off the same assumptions. And when you're playing in a multiplayer game, it's not always essential for you to do the most optimal thing all the time. If you're in a bad position and you've got a player next to you and there's a player across from you who's doing very well, you might agree to gang up on them. So if you're doing that sort of like politicking, you're creating alliances, you'll need to be able to talk to people about that. So hence the social skill element. Next slide, please. So just some sort of common ones amongst them. Amongst those three, as I said, rolling dice, most common in Dungeons and Dragons, but also takes place in Magic the Gathering. Don't knock your dice off the table if possible. Often there's a degree of note-taking. For example, if you're playing in Pokemon at a tournament level, you might want to record how many times your opponent has used a particular move, because they might only be able to use it 5 times or something. So you can record that, you might be able to gain an advantage. Same with Magic the Gathering. You might want to write down what cards you've seen from your opponent so you know what to do for the next time. The more gross motor coordination thing I most commonly think of is walking between tables in event halls or in like a shop if you're playing there. At big tournaments, there's often very long tables with chairs on both sides, and then there's another table like 2 meters away with people sat in between the two of them. Can be quite a tight fit. You have to be able to maneuver yourself and not knock into people, not fall over, not hurt yourself. As well, positioning on a chair and being able to reach across the table should you need to, for example, read one of your opponent's cards. Or if you're playing D&D with friends, you might want a snack that's on the opposite side of the table, and you need to be able to do that without knocking over the 2-litre bottle of Coke or whatever. So there's the mathematics element, which is inherent within all 3 of these, really. You need to be able to memorize information and record it as well and comprehend what you've written down. There is the element of visuospatial awareness as well when it comes to moving yourself around a space. Reading whatever's in front of you, the cards, the rules, whatever it might be, and anticipating what your opponent might do. Or what you might need to do in future. There's the communication element, which we've covered. And so there's a shop called Geek Retreat, right? I don't know if anyone's been to Geek Retreat. Great stores, set stores. They cater towards people with nerdy interests. You can play Pokemon, you can play, Magic, you can play Yu-Gi-Oh, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever. Their main colour is bright yellow and purple, which is not the most agreeable combination. And if you struggle with very bright and gaudy environments, then that can be a bit of an issue. As well, they tend to have very bright overhead lights. So wherever you go, you're going to be exposed to sensory information and sensory input. It might not always be the most well-suited environment to you, in which case you might want to think about, okay, well, where else can I play? Can I play in my front room around my coffee table with friends? Can we go to a pub where it's quieter perhaps, or there's more dimmed lights and that's more manageable for me? There's the smell element. There might be food being prepared in the space that you don't like the smell of. There are often issues with body odour, which you can't really do much about. In fact, there's actually a rule in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is another card game, that players have to have good hygiene, basically, because there's been repetitive issues around that. Anyway, if you're in a very enclosed space with lots of people as well, it might be very warm, might be humid, and if you struggle with the heat, then that will be difficult. And does the space have food that you can eat? Not even as far as like a sensory standpoint, but if you're gluten-free and there's only gluten food there, then you probably need to consider other options. Next slide, please. So there's two really major distinctions in terms of where you play these games, I think. The first one is a sort of sanctioned environment, so like a tournament space. There are rules here, there are judges who enforce those rules and resolve disputes. When you sign up to this tournament, usually you'll pay a fee, and when you do, you agree to follow all of the rules of the tournament. If you're caught cheating or not following one of the rules, you can be penalised, you can be disqualified, you might lose one of the matches or something like that. So there are quite clearly defined expectations of you. Similarly, connected to that are consequences if the rules aren't followed. So often organisers will distribute like a list of rules that they expect you to follow and they expect you to know beforehand. So you can sort of get an expectation of what the space will look like and what things will be at play, what you need to be aware of. And then on to the next slide, please. The other environment is the casual one. It might be in your front room, it might be at your kitchen table, it might be in a shop, playing with someone where there is no stakes. If you lose, there's no consequence. If you break the rules, there's no consequence, because you're all just there, and if you can agree that everything's okay, then it is. So these environments are more easily altered and made, accommodating for people. Like I said, if you can't have gluten and the shop you're in doesn't have gluten, only has gluten food, then you can just go to the shop and get something else and bring it home, and then you don't have to worry about that. Similarly, there are rules against wearing headphones and things in sanctioned tournaments, because there's a worry that you'll be being fed information, which would be considered cheating. If you want to wear your headphones while you're sat around a table with your friends playing, then so long as everyone understands that, that's fine. There's no advantage to be gained by doing that. And yeah, people just getting together and having fun is the main thing here. It's not about winning or losing necessarily, but it's just about everyone having a good time. And next slide, please. So within sanctioned play, just one example is, and I think people I know have had trouble with this. If you have difficulty with shuffling, then you can actually ask a judge to shuffle for you, so that you're basically not accused of doing something incorrectly by your opponent, which might cause them to disqualify you or something similar, or penalise you in some way. So it might mean that you choose to play a deck which doesn't require you to shuffle as much, which is a workaround, but there is an option available to you within the present rule set to assist you. with a more casual environment with Dungeons and Dragons, for example, if you feel uncomfortable leaving your house for whatever reason, be it due to public transport difficulties, maybe anxiety, then there are options available for you to play online with other people. What I've pictured here is a website called Roll20, which is you can just open it up in your browser and look for it, and you can play Dungeons and Dragons with your friends online, and all of the equipment that you would need is there. You can voice chat with other people. You can take yourself out of the game if you want, and it's totally just it's under your control. You know, you're not subject to things that would be uncontrolled, apart from other people who also can't be controlled. Don't do that. Next slide, please. So, this. I mean, I'm not going to summarise all the information here, but what needs to change? It's subjective. It's best that you understand yourself, where your strengths lie, where perhaps areas of that you may need support, and what can be done to encourage your strengths and to limit the difficulties that you might experience. For those more formal environments, definitely pre-warning or communicating with judges or event organisers before the event takes place will help you to understand what's expected, where the wiggle room lies in terms of what changes can be made, where you can be supported and encouraged. I'll come back to the what is reasonable point, because that's a later thing. But also, if you know a person who is in need of some kind of change made, it's best to, I would say, best to accept it. And then once you're out of the situation, have a conversation with the person as to why, if they feel comfortable expressing it. You know, the way that we do things at Axia is under the auspices of the partnership model, which understands that people are experts on themselves. Therefore, you should take their words. That you should take their word when it comes to matters relating to them. So, before I go on to the next section, I want to talk a little bit about the distinctions between the sanctioned environment and the casual environment. So, as I said, the sanctioned environment, you're going into a space with an expectation that there are rules and boundaries and things that you have to abide by. There might be space to make changes, but it's dependent on you being able to make your case and a judge or another person, an officiator, being willing to listen to you and to implement that change. So it requires, I feel like, much more negotiation. That casual environment where there is no advantage to be gleaned, there's no consequences, can be more easily adapted. However, if people don't feel like making the change, they don't have to. You know, it's reliant on them taking your word, understanding you, and respecting you to the degree that they're happy to make that accommodation for you. So there's positives and negatives to both, which is the point I'm trying to make. Next slide, please. So I'm no legal expert, hold my hand up and say, but this is my interpretation of the Equality Act, and this you can look this up. This is just available online. Won't read it verbatim, but effectively, the responsibility is placed on the person who is providing, or the institution that is providing a service, or that requires you to be in a specific place to make a change for you. It's not on the individual to adjust themselves to make the situation more manageable for them. It should be made to assist them. The reason for this is that having a disability is a protected characteristic under the law. If a protected characteristic is not understood and accommodated for, it becomes an issue of discrimination, which is in breach of the law. So, effectively, it's in the best interests of the person to have reasonable adjustments made for them, because their life becomes easier. They presumably feel less anxious and any other number of negative emotions. And if it's a workplace, they're likely to get a better employee, or if they're an education system, a better student, whatever it might be. Next slide, please. Yes, so the quote in there is to take such steps as is reasonable, but reasonable is vague. The information I found online points to consideration from both sides. It can't be dictatorial on the part of the person who needs adjustments made, because sometimes those adjustments might be unreasonable or unfeasible for the person on whom the responsibility falls to implement. So the three things recommended to keep in mind are: how practical is it to implement? It needs to be feasible in terms of like how much it costs, and it needs to be shown to be beneficial for the person. So they say that if, like these sites say that if you can satisfy those three criteria, then you should be good. But obviously, being able to answer those three questions will require time, consideration, research, knowledge and understanding of yourself as well. It may be that an aspect of a job cannot, a requirement of the job exposes you to certain stresses or things that cannot be changed. In that case, it might be that the job isn't well suited to you, because if that's a factor about the job that cannot change, then it's unreasonable for the employer to change that aspect. And yeah, as it says there, it's not simply a matter of what you may personally think is reasonable. So it's not the individual who has all of the power in this. With this comes a need for negotiation and understanding where that middle ground lies. Next slide, please. So an example from the workplace. This is Patrick. He has a lovely cat next to him, and by the looks of it, some delightful plants and a breakfast. Recently diagnosed as autistic while employed. He has struggled for a long time with difficulty around sound, which causes him to feel very anxious and overwhelmed. Though he's been coping with this, recently having received his diagnosis, he is considered disabled. It's a protected characteristic. So in terms of the law, he has the bargaining power to approach a manager to discuss what might be available in terms of making his life more manageable, because he doesn't want to be feeling anxious, he doesn't want to be feeling overwhelmed. The conversation with his manager is fruitful, and he is offered the opportunity to work from home 2 days a week on the busiest days in the office when the most people come in, and he finds it difficult to cope. So in this situation, Patrick has been struggling with it for a long period of time, probably been masking his distress, which may well have prompted him to seek an assessment. It's obviously in his workplace's best interests to have Patrick be free from anxiety and be able to work to the quality standards that he is known for, and so they implement this reasonable adjustment because they know that he will be happier and therefore more productive. In a cynical way, they know they're going to get more from him if they do it. Next slide, please. Farah is dyspraxic. They are studying at university, and their degree involves an element of written assessment. They haven't disclosed that they're dyspraxic because they don't want to be seen as different or noted or put their head above the parapet, effectively. So what can be done more subtly in this situation? So Farah feels with no other recourse that they have to go to the disability, can't remember the word, department, don't know if that's the right word, at the university, who can discuss with them what might be available to them in terms of reasonable adjustments. So rather than forcing Farah to write out their exam, they are offered a laptop and an extension on the time and a room away from other people who perhaps might look at them with some confusion as to why they're using a laptop when everyone else has to write their things down. So universities have money set aside specifically for disability assistance. So first of all, it's financially feasible, it's realistically implemented, and it's beneficial for FARA because they're able to complete their exam. They're not exposed to further anxiety because people are noticing them using their laptop during exam. So it kind of answers all three of those criteria. Next slide, please. So I think I went over this a little bit before, but the consequence for not complying with the duty to implement reasonable adjustments is discrimination, which, having looked up, can carry a fine of up to £5,000, which obviously no one would want to have to pay. Also, being in breach of the law is a pretty bad thing. So, again, it's in no one's best interest for anyone to be in breach of the law, and it's in everyone's best interests for the student to be faring better and to be able to achieve better grades because they're not struggling with anxiety and fatigue. And the educational body will receive better results, which looks good on Ofsted. Yeah, and next slide, please. So this is also individual, but how is it best to ask? So if you're in the workplace, there may well be an occupational health department set up to sort of manage this, to consider what changes can be made to make the environment more accessible and manageable. If not, it may be a case of just approaching your manager or your employer. If you have a good relationship with them, it may take the form of a face-to-face conversation, a bit more of an unstructured discussion if you feel that you can trust that person. Alternatively, you might want to compose all of this into an email and send it across and CC in a load of people if you're finding that face-to-face discussion difficult. Also, kind of hit on it a little bit before, but that forewarning and that advanced planning is important. If you can notify, for example, a doctor prior to an appointment or to an operation that you struggle with certain things or that you might like certain adjustments made, they are then aware of it, and because they're aware of it, they have to act on it to avoid discriminating. So really, like the sort of advanced planning process, I would say, is very important, and comes back to what I was saying about understanding yourself and being able to ideally verbalise that to other people. So to reiterate points, it goes without saying, but adjustments can take practically any form in any situation. It can be the casual environment that we described, where there is absolutely no responsibility on anyone to do anything other than respecting a person and accounting for their differences. You know yourself best. You can best define what it is that you feel you need. But you also need to take into consideration in the workplace, in other situations, in education, their side of things, what's reasonable. The responsibility is not on disabled people to change who they are to meet the needs and expectations of others. It is on the environment to change to suit them. Luke Bearden, who is speaking at the next PDSG, has the equation autism plus environment equals outcome. It's not on the autistic person to change. The environment will better suit or not quite as well suit the person, depending on where they are, what they're doing, who they're with. So as I said, the changes are not limited only to those official settings, like the tournament or the workplace. It can also just be a social setting, but be aware that there's no overarching structure to sort of guide that interaction. So also a public service as well. I wish I did a little bit more looking into this one, but they basically said if there's anything that's being provided by council/government, it needs to be cognizant of other people's needs, and adjustments need to be made to make things accessible. For example, like, I don't know, King Charles's coronation. I would imagine that would have had like accessibility features, basically. So that's everything. On the last slide is some links. I think I spoke about some of them. There's obviously the Equality Act there, and a little bit more to do with disability discrimination and reasonable adjustments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ren. I think you can see how we started off with a discussion about games, and one of the issues, Calvin, if you don't mind me saying, was you were... Yeah. Yeah, that Calvin was going to some Pokemon tournaments, and
I won 4.
you did do very well, but it made me think how difficult it was, because he couldn't... lots of people had all these notebooks and were writing everything down, and Cal can't do that, I can't do that. So it then sort of led on to this really interesting discussion that occurred over quite a few weeks, wasn't it? Quite a few collectives where we started to think how complex it is to ask for reasonable adjustments. You know, it sounds like quite a simple thing, but you need to really, really understand what the job is or the task is, and that needs to be broken down into very small steps so you could see where adjustments could be made. And also this term, I think, Dream, you were saying quite often that key for you was, what does reasonable mean? Yeah. So, do people have any questions?
Unrelated, but probably related as well.
Yeah.
Anyone else feeling really hot in here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've...
The air conditioning.
Okay, so a sensor... Thanks very much for that. As people who know me well know that I've been born in the wrong country. This is a wonderful temperature for me. So I have no idea that other people are. So a reasonable adjustment. So why did no one else speak up? Couldn't be asked.
Don't want to disrupt things for other people.
I thought it was just me.
You thought it was just you?
I wasn't better.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Right. Okay, so some people thought it was just them. Some people didn't want to interrupt. Some people couldn't be asked. Some people didn't notice. So can you see even... I'm not trying to manufacture this, but a reasonable adjustment now is to open that window.
I saw you mess with that thermostat.
But we were all sitting here for various reasons, not mentioning. Now, this is a group where... Thank you for raising it. We've known each other a long time. I think you probably feel quite comfortable in saying to me, Linda, this room is boiling. Did you not notice? Because this radiator's on.
I thought that was...
Yeah. So,
It's like when you go into supermarkets now, they've got the air conditioning on so high.
yeah,
And it's like,
it's freezing.
But I think that's food preservation.
Food preservation, yeah. Yeah. So even something as simple as in this group, trying to get the temperature right and making that reasonable for everybody. So, Dream, is that reasonable for you, being sat by...
Oh God, I thought about 20 past. I'm just going to have to leave.
Did you?
I've had to do that at the vets.
Have you?
That was the first time I found out that I can overheat and not recognise it.
Really?
I start feeling sick and weird and something's wrong, and I don't know what it is. And then I realised today, same as the vets, it's like, that's too hot.
Yeah.
So I'd already been looking at that door thinking, I don't want to get in front of the camera.
Yeah.
So if I just nip out there,
Yeah.
I think I'm going to faint. But I didn't, so. But it's the problem of not being able to recognise things like bodily temperature, hunger, stuff like that. I didn't realise until I was diagnosed that that was what was going on.
Yeah.
Recognising it.
So one of the things that Ren pointed out, quite rightly, is that at Axia, we do believe that people are the experts on themselves. But sometimes we don't always know yet. We don't always fully understand ourselves. And if we don't fully understand ourselves, how are we then going to communicate that to other people? So I've learned, because everyone has said to me when they come into my house, this is like the tropical gardens at Kew. Yeah, tropical gardens and Kew. No. So at Kew, I've learned that because people say to me, this is real. What, Cal? The full bucking, yeah, they do sometimes say that as well. But yeah, so I've learnt, Calvin's my son, by the way, in case people are worried that there's disrespect going on in the room. Clearly there is, but that's all right between mother and son. But yeah, so I've learnt because people have pointed it out to me. So maybe sometimes we can't necessarily know. So you didn't find out until you went to the vets?
Yeah, I was taking the dog to the vet, sitting there with my mum, and started saying to her, something's not right, I don't feel well at all. And after about 5 minutes, she said, I think you're too hot.
Right.
And I hadn't realised that it was
Yeah.
that. So I just went outside, and as soon as I was outside, I realised, oh yeah, I am well too hot. Took my coat off, got some fresh air, and then went back in.
Yeah.
But like I say, I was sitting there not knowing.
Yeah. So again, one of the things that I say is that parents are the experts on their children. And having met your wonderful mother, she's still obviously dream you're too hot. Take your coat off. Questions then, or any other reasonable adjustments around this room? This room keeps changing. Elliot.
It's for the D&D thing. There's actually an app or website called D&D Beyond that lets you roll dice online, and it also like keeps track of all the things on your character sheet, like what abilities you have, how much damage it does, what the ability does. It saves a lot of note-taking and a lot of like bookkeeping if you're really wanting to do that. So I just figured I'd mention that in case there are any D&D players who might feel overwhelmed by all that.
That's really helpful. And again, I'm not just making this a contrived thing, but again, in line with the partnership model, what we like to say is that we do have expertise, clearly we do, and Elliot's just demonstrated the expertise that he has around this, but it's important that you deliver it in the right way so that people can hear it. If you deliver it from a position of thinking you're the expert and everyone else is not, then you'll come unstuck. Whereas Elliot, you delivered that brilliantly in terms of, I don't think that undermined anything you'd said or done. It just added and enhanced to it. So thank you, Elliot. Thank you. Yes. So I'll try and summarise. There's a number of very important components in there. So there's something called right to choose, which means that you can go to your general practitioner and ask to be referred to any service that has a contract with the NHS for ADHD, autism and so on. We at Axia do not have a contract for ADHD, and we're not best placed really to do ADHD in isolation because we can't prescribe medication. And we don't particularly want to get into prescribing medication because it takes us into a whole different area that is very, very complicated. Psychiatry UK is one of the places that does a lot of right to choose for ADHD, but it is, as you say, Pat, all online. And Axia, we offer both online and face-to-face so that we can make reasonable adjustments accordingly. But most, I would say most, if not all of our competitors are nearly totally online. I suppose the only thing that you could do is contact the Integrated Care Board, the ICB, and say that you, under Right to Choose, have been offered Psychiatry UK. However, you can't actually complete the paperwork, so you're being discriminated against. I know from some of our competitors that if you don't provide certain information, you don't get an appointment, and they just say you haven't done this, therefore you don't have an appointment. Again, I'm not trying to say we're the best thing in the world, because clearly we've still got lots to learn, but at Axia, with the developmental history questionnaires, which we recognise are daunting, they are, yes, some people, I really apologise. What we do offer is a service that people like Lucy and Ebony do, where they actually contact people prior to the appointment and say, we will help you fill this in. And we'll do this in whatever way you like. If you want to speak to us, if you want to text us, if you want to email us, so that we actually offer help filling in these forms. We recognise that filling a form in is the minute you start to think about yourself in this way and make statements about yourself is potentially distressing. We also recognise that if you're filling in the forms for your child or a relative, that sometimes that makes you think about yourself. And that can have what we call the ripple effect, where people go, filling this in about my child reminds me that maybe what I was like when I was growing up. So it's a very complicated process, and I think going forward there is this expectation that if you can't do things online, you know, banking, everything, it's the minute it works brilliantly until you hit a problem, and then trying to speak to a human being becomes, a lot of people nodding, it becomes really difficult.
The worst thing
I think you're right, Pat. My understanding of some of the online people is that they say if there isn't a developmental history that's corroborated by somebody, that they won't proceed with the diagnosis. Now, clearly, we assessed somebody who was 83, and there wasn't anybody who could talk about this person's childhood. However, that didn't stop us arriving at a diagnosis, but I know it does prevent some people. Shall we have a 15-minute break? Have we brought Post-its so people could write down any questions?
Yeah, there's Post-its, so there's a
Okay.
pencils, but there's little pencils.
Thank you, Joe. So if you don't feel able to ask a question, verbally in this group, if you want to write anything down on the Post-its and bring them to the front, we'll answer them. And then we'll see if there's any more questions, and then we'll move on to a couple of other items, if that's okay. Okay, so 15-minute break, please. Now. Yeah, we're ready to make a start. Excellent. I forgot to say... No,
Just knock on the radio if you can't.
look on... I'm not going to do that. Do you reckon?
Yeah.
Go on then.
You like your glasses. On the radio. No, with your glasses.
Oh, and my glasses. No, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, on the glass though.
Oh, I see. Dyspraxia in action. Joe was trying to explain to me how to get people's attention, and what I think you were saying was I needed to knock the glasses on the glass, but I went to proceed to smack the glass onto the radiator, which probably wouldn't have really... Anyway, everyone, I've got everyone's attention now. That's great. So I forgot to say that over the break, any time you come to the post-diagnostic support groups, over the break there are books at the back for you to borrow. We've got members of our admin team here who can keep a record of who borrows what. Not that we don't think you're going to return it, but just so we can make sure that if we need to order more copies of books, we can. There's also the autism and other alert cards there. So if you lose or didn't get a card, please just take one of those. Again, if you could let our admin team know, just in case we need to order any more. So our admin team are going to be a regular feature now of coming here. Now we've actually got a full admin complement, a full team, that we're going to be having our admin people coming. So sometimes people need letters for their employer with the dates of all of the post-diagnostic support groups, and that can be tailored to you. So again, our admin team will be able to help you with that. If you've lost something to do with a report or the to whom it may concern, then again, anything that's administrative can be dealt with. So, over the break, has anyone had a thought about any questions around Ren's presentation? Yes? Okay, so for the recording, somebody very kindly shared some personal experiences around inpatient units and the struggle to get reasonable adjustments within that. Ren, I'm going to ask, because of your previous experience as a mental health nurse and some of your work before, and I know you did some work on trying to get reasonable adjustments in inpatient and acute settings, would you mind just saying some of the struggles and challenges you had?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ren.
Hello, thank you for sharing. So previously I've worked in mental health units, obviously as a mental health nurse, so kind of being on the opposite end of this. I've definitely seen people struggle to get reasonable adjustments for any number of things. One of the presentations I'd done previously, and one of my dissertation was on how ill-suited acute mental health environments are for autistic people. kind of I think the priority focus for professionals working in those environments is making sure that that person is safe and not at risk of harming themselves further. And often that acts as a bit of a barrier for them seeing anything else. They get kind of tunnel vision and they go, if this isn't being, any sort of budging from this might mean that this person comes to harm, which can lead to a bit of, a lot of inflexibility. So as far as advice, I'm not really sure what to offer, because I would try to escalate things if possible. If you can get family members, or if you could write to whoever might be in charge of the unit, there is often a ward manager and a unit manager, then you can you can have the discussion with them there. But it is a case of just kind of making your wishes known, I think, most importantly. I hope that helps. I'd echo the comments about getting things formalised in writing as well, and continue to escalate. And if you think things aren't happening that you want to, you can escalate to the MP level even, and they have power and can involve themselves in these situations to hopefully resolve and find outcomes that suit everyone, ideally.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the second part of your presentation, because it's quite relevant for me at the moment. So I've been off sick since December for mental health reasons. I'm due to go back to work next week. Oh, just to say, I got my diagnosis for autism in February. So lots of reasons why I'm off, probably around that. But I've got a manager who's not very good. She's been my manager for nearly 9 years. I told her that I had the diagnosis of autism, and she just said, well, 90% of people are on the spectrum, which I'm sure we've all heard all the time. So instantly dismissed straight away. Previous to that, she'd said that it's the menopause, it's not autism, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, she doesn't know me, because what I'm going to do is when I'm in work, I'm clearly masking. I didn't know this until, obviously... So I'm back in work next Thursday. I am working with Access to Work, so I don't know if you know about Access to Work. So I've got a really good coach who is bombarding her with emails about what needs to be done. And I must admit, I am anxious about having to sort of deal with her, really. I think she'll give me the forms to fill in and get me to sort of get on with it. So I think it's just... I've got occupational health are aware, so they have told me if obviously she doesn't do certain things, then I've got them to fall back on, and I've got Access to Work to fall back on. But, I don't like awkward conversations, and I'm just going to find it, I feel like my stress is already sort of increasing, when really, from my point of view, I started on tablets recently for depression. And it's kind of like not one of those conversations I really want. I just kind of want... There are things... I'm actually a specialist nurse. So there are reasonable adjustments that I need that I didn't really realise before. And I think they're all doable. But I'm already thinking I'm going to face barriers as soon as I start the conversation. So I'm not really sure what I'm asking. It was more just sort of my situation at the moment, really. So... Sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I was going to say, obviously, involving any kind of advocate is massively helpful. If you have someone in your corner who can fight your case and justify the things that you might find challenging to raise, then that's excellent. And I'm not well versed in what was it? Access to Work. Sorry, but we have had. Yeah.
I think you've got everything behind you that you need, to be honest. Occupational health and Access to Work. Access to Work are brilliant. I've used those in the past for myself.
I've had quite a few conversations with them. It's been really...
Yeah, they're very, very good.
I instantly felt like I had finally somebody on my side.
Yes, you definitely have got somebody on your side who will have a full understanding. I think one of the things you put in your presentation, Ren, that I'm not saying I don't know how you might bring this up in conversation with this person, is Ren put it's about people accepting, not necessarily understanding. So I think it's okay to say to somebody, first of all, I'll answer the next bit, I'll stick on this. It's okay to say you may never understand, why I need this, but can you please accept it? So I think it's about giving people permission to say, this is really complicated and you might never understand it, and that's fine. I don't expect you to understand it, but please accept what I'm saying. And I think it's quite hard to argue that, because you'd have to then say, well, I'm not going to accept it. So then are you accusing me of being a liar? I'm not trying to stick up for her, but can you imagine that somebody's just come to you that you've managed for 8.5 years and suddenly they say, actually, I'm autistic. And they're thinking about the last 8.5 years and they can't get it. If she says, we're all on the spectrum, I'd point her to some of the presentations on the Axia website. Sometimes I say, well, it's a bit like being pregnant. We're not all a little bit pregnant. You either are pregnant or you're not pregnant. And when she mentioned about the menopause, there's also very clear guidelines about what employers need to do for women who are perimenopausal and menopausal.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things on the slides was if change is not being if change is not being made and you can prove that it's, disadvantaging you in some way, then it's an issue of discrimination. So, I mean, obviously it depends, as I said, on the scope of the role. If a job requires you to do something and you're unable to do it, then it's not realistically implementable from the employer's side. But if it's just a case of obstinacy and they're not wanting to make a change, then and they know it will help you, then it would be a case of discrimination. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Ren. I think prior to the Equality Act was the Disability Discrimination Act. And in some ways, that sounded like a more powerful act, doesn't it? 'Cause it's got disability discrimination in it. The shift to the Equality Act was that all major employers need to anticipate that people with disabilities are going to be in their workforce. So the Disability Discrimination Act was around individuals who became an employee and then the employer had to make adjustments. The Equality Act says you shouldn't be waiting for people to come to you. You should be anticipating this. So the first thing we've seen with that is, for example, the accessibility around people in wheelchairs. So all new buildings and so on have to assume there will be people in wheelchairs. But actually employers should now be assuming autistic people and other neurodivergent people are going to be in their workforce. So places like the NHS should be putting loads of things in place, not for individuals, but for the environment and the system as a whole. So again, you might want to point out this is not just about you as an individual. They have a responsibility under the Equality Act to anticipate. I think, do you remember that word, Ren, anticipate? Yeah, so you have to anticipate that people will be joining you. Sorry, I'm standing right in front of you.
No, it's okay. I positioned myself there. So, I mean, sorry, does anyone have any other questions?
I think Sarah Hendricks in her latest book speaks about a lot of women when they hit, I'm not saying menopause, it's none of my business, but that a lot of women when they hit menopause, that they can't carry on with the masking and the strategies that have worked so successfully up to then. And that's a lot of, when we see a lot of autistic women, it's when they hit perimenopause and menopause, they go, I can't do it anymore. So again, you might want to refer her to Sarah Hendricks' latest book on women and girls on the spectrum. Have a look before you go, see if there's see what's up there. And sorry, that's my fault. So before you go, if anyone would like to borrow a book, please do so. And if you need an alert card, please do so.
I was just going to say, often there is a big precipitating factor before someone kind of seeks, not all the time, but seeks a diagnosis. Why have I been coping well up to this point, but then all of a sudden something's changed, don't know what it is, and suddenly I can't cope anymore. And obviously a diagnosis can explain some of that. You might be aware then of features that you perhaps hadn't considered before that were building stress. And only now, with the label or with the explanation in hand, do you feel able to make the change? You know, it's different for everyone. But I think, like, it's not a paradox to be able to get up to a certain point and manage things well and keep everything, you know, below the boiling point, and then suddenly explode because you're not even aware of necessarily of what you're bearing up to that point, like you were saying about not having realised you were masking for 8.5 years.
I didn't know about it until last year when I started reading about autism, and
Yeah.
you start thinking about things, you're like, I get it.
But it's also then not inexplicable because there is an explanation, but other people might find it hard to accept because they don't understand, which comes back to acceptance first, which I think is the most important thing when it comes to making that adjustment. Is why would this person come to me with a request unless they felt it was very important? You know, so like, message to all employers, I guess, is treat people's requests with respect. But you know, for people seeking the adjustments, then it takes a lot to get to that point in the first instance, which I recognise. But of course, knowing yourself comes first. Any other questions?
Can we move on to the questions for Luke? Because I think that's a question for Luke. Because I've also asked him about some of Francesca Happy's stuff around what I call phenotype and genotype, which does relate to the normal distribution curve. And I've already sent that question to Luke. Now, there might be some people who, don't mean this disrespectfully, but some people who aren't necessarily following some of that conversation in terms of the terminology of spectrum versus constellation versus the normal distribution curve. And I think we should get a question formulated for Luke around the notion of the spectrum being potentially an unhelpful one if it implies, if an interpretation of a spectrum. I think he will argue that the terminology for autism has been fraught with difficulties for decades, from the beginning onwards, and is still fraught with difficulties. So I think if we could, and obviously if that won't be recorded around the personal circumstance that you mentioned, will it, Dream? It'll only be on.
Oh, no, the questions and answers generally get edited
Yeah.
out.
Okay.
Unless the
Okay.
response has been repeated the question.
Yeah.
So it just focuses on.
So in terms of the normal distribution curve, it goes like that. Yeah. And as you said, there's like cut-offs at each end of like roughly, psychologists have done this, 2.2% roughly at each end. And the majority of people fall into the middle. Now, some people, when they argue about we're all a little bit autistic, they might say that in terms of, say, for instance, height is on a normal distribution curve. And there comes a point at which we say, these people are really tall, these people are really short, these people are average. So you could argue that autism is part of the normal distribution curve, and maybe it's only the 2.2% at this end who meet the criteria and none of the rest do. However, I agree with you, Dream, around what's the notion of a spectrum. I think I see it more as a sphere, like a football, and that people often bounce backwards and forwards in that football. Following on from what you said, Ren, about if you put someone in the right environment, they might be in a particular position in the football. If you put them in the wrong environment, they're in another position. But the honest answer is we have not got these diagnostic criteria correct. We never have done, we never will do, and this is an evolving, it's not, there's so much subjectivity to this, and so many key players, like people like Simon Baron-Cohen, Francesca Happy, some of these people that sort of dominate the thinking. And they have differences of opinion based on their own personal experiences, their own upbringing. If you look at the vast majority of the key players in the field, they've been men. They've been men that probably come from quite wealthy backgrounds. A lot of academics who have, again, come from quite privileged backgrounds. So we've got all this complexity of where class, finance, intellect, privilege, power. So this is incredibly complicated. I'm going to try and formulate that into a question for Luke, but I'm hoping you will come and try and say that question again for Luke in a way that he can answer. So if I now say then, thank you, Ren, don't you have to stand up anymore. Can I just, before I move on to a few little bits before we finish, can I ask you to thank Ren in the way that you feel comfortable in thanking? I thought it was, I think a key word for me is to say to people, you may never understand, but can you please accept? Okay, so Luke is coming on the 10th of July, and it's a question and answer session. He, in my opinion, quite foolishly has said you can ask anything you like. But he will be here in person, and if you've heard him speak before, you will know you're in for a treat. If you haven't heard him speak before, please come along. How much, Joe, what's the time, please? 6 minutes to go. Okay, two things then. First of all, Hilary isn't here, so I'm hoping she'll be here next time. The Tatton Royal Horticultural Show starts, I think, the 17th of July. So it'd be lovely for people to come along and see the garden's not autistic. I keep saying, clearly the garden's not autistic. The garden that she has designed based on input from autistic individuals. That's at Tatton. And it follows on, I think, from if you watched Chris Packham describing the garden at Chelsea, I think that is really interesting as well. There's a clip on have we put anything on? Yes, we have. Thank you. Thanks, Dream. Yeah, well done, Dream. Thank you. So I think the other thing we can put on the website is the CAS review. Have we done anything on that, Dream? No. Okay, so Taya and Hannah, the two work-based learners, who I'm not going to ask to say anything because they didn't know I was going to ask them to do anything. The CAS review came out recently. It was a review of transgender services headed up by a paediatrician called Cass. And when we first read it, Calvin and I felt we needed to issue some sort of position statement while we were waiting for it to be thoroughly read. So it's 388 pages. The position statement we had, which it just follows through the partnership model that Ren was explaining, is that people are the experts on themselves. So we felt that transgender people were the experts on themselves, quite rightly, and that would what we would stick with. Our work-based learners have done the most amazing review that I suggest we put on the website now. I know you wanted to do a couple more amendments, so can we make sure we have the correct version? Ebony, as person in charge of work-based learning, can you make sure we've got the most up-to-date, and that will go on the... Yeah, that will go... Lovely. That will go on the website, and you can see a very balanced view of the good things about that review and the not so good things about that review. Calvin is determined to monitor the impact of the CAS review, as he has concerns that there may be people who are identifying as trans who get diverted to our service saying, actually, you're not trans, you're autistic, because there's a suggestion in the review that that's a possibility that our work-based learners have alerted us to. So that will be being monitored by our service to see if there is an impact on the service. We are going to be at Chester Pride this year. Ren, you mentioned the preponderance of neurodivergence at places like D&D and Geek Retreat and so on. I found that when we went to Chester Pride a couple of years back that lots of people gravitated towards our stall, not necessarily because they were neurodivergent, although undoubtedly some of them were, but because they felt there was some allegiance in minorities sticking together and minorities being discriminated against. So we're going to have, Amy has negotiated a really good deal for us that we're going to be in a particular part of the Pride present exhibition, and we will be there with books and stickers and autism alert cards generally, so we can see if there are people there that might be interested. I know that when we took your book, Cal, to the Pride a couple of years back, it's more you sold more books at Pride than you'd ever sold at any National Autistic Society conference. So I don't know what that means. I've no idea how to make sense of that. But so there will be the publications, Dreams book. I see you got a copy there, Dream. Do you want a Dreams book? There will be my pamphlet, Calvin's. All right, it's a book. Calvin's book, and Jackie Brett has also written some publications. One of our associates, some of you may have been diagnosed by her. She's an occupational therapist and sensory integration trained therapist, and she's written 2 wonderful books, one for children and one for a workbook. That have we got copies of those here today, Joe?
The children's book,
Yeah.
I'm not sure we've got the workbook here.
Okay, don't worry. There's a QR code on the back if people want to buy a copy of that. So I'm going to stop now and say I hope that as many of you as possible can come on the 10th of July. And if you have questions you want to send in advance, Dream, what would be the...
Yeah, there'll be a post on the website, so that you'll have sort of 5 or 6 weeks before to know that Luke's coming. And what I'll do, I'll put an email up that'll go to Axia Social, and it'll just have the title, Question for Luke. So anyone that sees the post, click on the email thing and then just send a question in, and then they'll be able to put them all together for Luke.
All right, so thank you very much, everyone. So if you want to take a book now, Joe and Paula, can you just sort of hang around a bit around there and make a note if... Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.